Would you ever let anybody edit one of your RAW files? Well, that's precisely what my good friend Julian Baird did. He let me edit one of his favourite images. And let's just say it didn't quite turn out as I expected.
I wouldn't allow anyone to touch my RAW files.
I'm a little bit nervous.
Actually, you've done quite a different edit actually.
I'm very surprised at just how different they look.
You've definitely pushed it further now.
And so I think that's a mistake. I was recently approached by my friend Julian Baird to see if I wanted to take part in a collaboration. He wanted to carry out an experiment to see what would happen if somebody else edited one of his RAW files. Would they produce something that was very close to his original image, or would it be completely different? Now, I've been asked to do this sort of thing before, but I've always said no. In my experience, a RAW file is rarely an accurate representation of a photographer's original vision. Personally, I don't like sharing my images before they're finished, and so when I spoke to Jules a couple of weeks ago, I was keen to understand just how he felt about letting me edit one of his.
Normally, Chris, I wouldn't allow anyone to touch my RAW files. I mean, they're very much mine, you know, that I captured them. I have a certain vision about how I want that image to look, and therefore it's quite a personal thing for me to edit. You know, I want to express my creative vision when I edit that picture. So sort of handing it over halfway through the process, I have to admit, it's a little bit unsettling.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. Have you even shown your RAW files to anyone in the past?
I can't say I have. No, it's not something I would normally do. I think maybe the only time I've maybe done it is when I've done a video and I've done a bit on post-processing. Quite often the RAW file will be there, part of that screen capture, and I'll show the edit. But typically, no, people only get to see the end product.
Okay, mate. Well, come on in. Let's have a look at it.
All right, there you go. What do you think of that then?
Right. So I recognise that straight away. So that's going to be the Isle of Harris, isn't it? Is that Luskintyre Beach?
That is Luskintyre Beach, one of my absolute favourite locations to be. And I picked this image for a couple of reasons for you, because one, it's one of my favourites. I mean, and it has lots of memories that go along with it, as well as it being a picture. But also, I think for you, it's a coastal picture, it's a seascape picture, and it's got sort of well, as you can see from the sky, even in the RAW files, quite a bit of colour there in the sky. So I'm sort of really interested how you're going to translate this RAW file, because you're kind of mountains and moodiness. So I think this will be something a little bit different, something to get your teeth into.
Yeah, it's a good histogram, isn't it? So there's no problems there. I'm not going to have to pull any tricks out of the bag.
No, you should all be there. Shot on the Nikon D850, so you've got biddles of dynamic range, and yes, expertly crafted to get it in the in the histogram.
I think that's one of the things I'm looking forward to is editing a photo that has so much dynamic range, because I think your camera's got what, 2.5 stops more dynamic range than mine.
Yeah, it's quite it's a very, very good sensor that was on the D850. And it was shot lossless compressed RAW, so you've got all the bits there. So you've got the most that that camera has to offer.
Well, very good. Well, I'll go away then and have a little think about this, and then shall we get together in a couple of days and we'll do the big reveal?
I'll be really interested to see how you got on with this. I think it'll be a very interesting exercise.
I actually felt like this was a really big responsibility. I wanted to make sure that whatever I produced was as close to Julian's original vision as possible. And so I left it for a couple of days until I could really concentrate on what I was doing. My general approach to editing is to try and keep things as natural as I possibly can. What I'm trying to do is to exaggerate the features that I like about an image. And in this case, obviously we've got that beautiful bright sky. We've also got some lovely contrast in the foreground between the grasses and that white sand. And then we've got these hills in the distance where there isn't an awful lot of detail, so I'm not going to be too concerned about them. The other thing that I tend to do before I start processing an image is to examine the histogram. Now, on this case, we've got some quite dark shadow areas, and we've got some bright highlight areas, and we've got those two peaks in the histogram at either end. And my editing process is very much geared up towards bringing those tones towards the middle of the histogram. So we have a more sort of bell curve to the histogram rather than these two distinct peaks. The first thing I do with any image is I apply lens corrections, and what that does is it corrects any barrel distortion, and Jules was shooting here at 19mm, and it also removes any vignetting that the lens may have caused. As you can see straight away, that's really brightened up the image. Now normally the next thing that I do for an image is I clean up the dust spots, but because Jules is a bit of an old woman, very meticulous about keeping his equipment clean, in this case there are no dust spots to clean up at all. One thing that I do need to do to this image though is to level that horizon. For my eye that's just a little bit on the wonk, and all I'm going to do is use the auto level feature in the crop tool. So with those basic adjustments done, we can crack on with the main edit. Now most RAW files will lack contrast, so the very first thing that I do is to add contrast by applying a tone curve preset, and in this case I'm going to try a strong contrast preset. If I look at this image now, I think the main problem with it for me is that the foreground is very dark, so I want to brighten that up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a graduated filter to the bottom half of the image, and I'm going to push up the exposure, and I'm also going to lift the shadows slightly as well. Now you can see that by lightening that foreground, what I've done is I've pushed the pixels that were on the left hand side of the histogram more towards the centre. And now what I want to do is work on those pixels that are on the right hand side of the histogram and bring those more to the centre. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a graduated filter to the sky, and I'm going to darken the highlights and I'm going to darken the whites. I also want to exaggerate the warm colour of the sky, so I'm going to increase the colour temperature, make that a bit warmer, and also boost the saturation a little bit. Now if you look at that histogram, that looks a lot better. Those pixels are much closer to the centre of the histogram. So what I'm going to do next may seem a little bit odd. I'm going to apply some global adjustments. I'm going to push the brightness of the whole image up by about half a stop. I'm also going to lift the blacks up, and I'm going to give those midtones a bit of extra punch by pushing up the clarity. For this particular image, I'm now going to turn my attention to the foreground. What I want to do is to increase the contrast between those grasses and the whites of the sand, and I'm going to do that by reducing the luminance of the greens. And I'm also going to push up the clarity for the foreground only. So we're really cracking on with the edit now. The bulk of the edit has now been done, and the next thing that I want to do is to add a vignette to darken the edges of the frame so that I can pull the eye towards the centre. Now you remember earlier I brightened the image up a bit, and that's because when I add a vignette it does make the image feel a lot darker. With the vignette in place, all I need to do now really is to do some local adjustments. Now I'm very happy with the foreground, but the sky does need some work. It's a little bit dark in places and a little bit light in places. So I'm going to use some radial filters just to make some local adjustments to that sky and balance it out a little bit. So that's almost it for this image. To my eye, it does look a little bit dark. So I'm just going to bump up the shadows just a little bit. And then all that's left me to do is to apply some basic sharpening, and we're done. Now that that edit has been completed, we can look at the before and after alongside each other, and you can see what a dramatic change I've made to that image, but hopefully it's still relatively natural. All that I've done is try to exaggerate some of the very best features of that beautiful morning that Jules was presented with on the Isle of Harris. With the edit done, I was really keen to share with Jules what I had produced. If I'm honest, I was expecting it to be pretty close to Jules's original, and we would just spend time picking over small differences between the two images. As it turns out, that isn't quite what happened.
So Chris, how did you get on with editing my RAW file?
Well, I think I got on alright, mate. I really enjoyed it. It was different, and it's obviously a lovely image to work on. And those Nikon files, they're lovely files to work with.
Yeah.
But I did have to change my post-processing approach slightly. I didn't do what I would normally do with my Canon files.
Well, why is that? Was it the oodles of dynamic range, the sheer quality and megapixels?
I just don't think that the file responded in the same way as the Canon files do.
Right.
So there's a couple of things I missed out. For example, I didn't split tone this image. I would normally split tone my ones. I'm a little bit nervous about how you're going to receive this. So come on, let's get that over with.
Okay, shall we open them up then? Let's have a look.
Yeah, let's have a look.
Oh, right. Yeah, they're actually you've done quite a different edit, actually. It's quite an odd experience, I have to say. Actually, looking at one of your raw files or one of the images that you've created, and then someone else has edited it in quite a different style. I would say it's quite a different looking image.
I'm very surprised at just how different they look.
I am as well.
I wasn't expecting that at all.
Because this is the first time you've seen my edit, isn't it?
This is the first time I've seen your edit, so I hadn't seen how you'd done it.
Now that you've seen both images, do you have a preference, or would you have changed the way you edited this file based on what you saw my actual vision was?
Yeah, I definitely think that I would have done a little bit. I would have tried a little bit harder to retain some of the detail in the highlights, particularly in the sand and in the sea. I was focused much more on the texture of the grasses, and so that's where my attention was turned. And although I haven't blown anything out, it does lack a little bit of detail there. I think I get the feeling I've pushed the file a bit further than you did.
You've definitely pushed it further than I have. I mean, I'll go back to that point where you didn't know what the scene actually looked like, because these raw files, they're not necessarily true representation. So for me, the image is a little bit too bright, but that's understandable because you weren't there. So for me, having that more darker, those deeper shadows is a part of the image. So that's probably the thing that jumps out to me most. And maybe for me, the sky's maybe a little bit too warm, perhaps. I think it's lost some of the blue hues from the sky. So
my sky's definitely orange, and yours is pink and blue.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a mistake.
So I mean, do you see that? You say it's a mistake, but is it a mistake or just a choice that you've made? It's not really a mistake, is it?
I think one of the things that I always try to do with my images is I just try to, as I say, exaggerate what's there. I don't try and create a different illusion. Mm-hmm. I don't try and create something that's different. What I'm trying to do is exaggerate what was there, and that's why it's interesting to look at the two images alongside. I mean, yours was obviously a much closer representation to what the scene looked like at the time. And so, is it a mistake? Yes. Is it a mistake I could have avoided? Probably not.
No, and I think that's the thing. This is why this exercise, I think, is quite interesting, because it's amazing how you can get. I mean, it's obviously the same scene, but they're actually two very different interpretations of what essentially is the raw file. So, there's a lot to be said for capture, but I think there's also most of that photograph comes through in how you edit it, isn't it? So, I just want one last question. So, this is not the typical scene that you would take. It's pinky skies. It's got a bit of sea. It's coast. It's quite different from the Lake District. I mean, did you find that any sort of a challenge? I mean, did that play in things at all?
I don't think I did at the time, but now that we're looking at the images afterwards, I think it's clearly played a part in it, and it has challenged me to think a lot more about the scene and bringing out what you feel about the scene more than just kind of going through your set process. So that's been a big learning case, because I have a set process for every image, but then a lot of my images are taken under very similar conditions in very similar locations.
Yeah, cool.
There you go. So it's been a few days since I spoke to Jules, and I've had some time to reflect on the experiment. If I'm being honest, I was a little shocked and more than a little embarrassed at just how different my version was from Julian's original. My shot was a lot brighter, had very different colourings, and had a completely different feel to it. Having never done anything like this before, I don't think I truly appreciated just how much your memory of a particular shoot plays in the edit. If you don't have that memory because you weren't there at the time, or because you've left it a long time before editing the image, there's a risk that what you end up producing could be very different from reality. Now, of course, Julian and I are still mates, and aside from a little bit of embarrassment on my part, I think we both found it a really interesting experiment. And if you want to see if Julian fared better at editing one of my photos, then check out his video. There's a link in the description below.